I had a request a little while back now for a video all about cross-stitch tools and supplies. What do you actually need versus what's kind of unnecessary? Where does it make sense to invest versus just sticking with the cheap option? So let's do that today. If you're new here today, hello, my name is Michelle and I love to do all of the crafts, but especially the stitchy ones. On this channel you'll find mostly cross-stitch, yarn crafts and sewing, but also plenty of experiments in other crafts too, because while variety may not be amazing for the YouTube algorithm, it is the spice of life. So this topic is going to be kind of subjective in parts, and you might very much disagree with some of my takes, but that is a good thing. Share your thoughts down in the comments, and between us we'll help any newbies out there get both sides of the argument and make the best decision for them. Right, I'm gonna put chapters in this video so you can just skip to the bit that interests you, but otherwise, let's start at the start. If you're completely new to cross-stitch, don't let anybody tell you otherwise. You are only going to need 3 things. Something to stitch with, something to stitch on, and of course, something to stitch. If your first step into the craft is to buy a kit, then it's probably going to have all of that included for you already. This makes kits really great for beginners and an excellent way to find out if you even like the craft without a lot of faffing around. But we'll go through each of those points separately just in case you're not convinced by kits or you just love extraneous info. Something to stitch with is your cross-stitch needle and your thread or floss. Needles are very cheap and they can be picked up at basically any craft-related shop or easily found online. Don't overthink it, pick up a size 24 and you're all set. For floss, you do have a few options, but by far the biggest brand is DMC, and their basic floss offering is called stranded cotton. I would highly recommend sticking with this for beginners, for reasons we'll go over later in the flosses section, but just for now, it's going to make your life easier. Something to stitch on is your fabric. I actually have a video all about different types of cross-stitch fabric, the pros and cons and what to look out for with each, but in the interests of keeping this simple, you just want to grab yourself some Aida fabric. This is Aida here. You can see it's basically formed of little squares with very distinct holes, so you can easily see where to put the needle as a beginner. Unless you choose a pattern that recommends something else, 14 count is the most common and the best for newbies, and white or another light colour will be easiest to work on at first. Again, if you did buy a kit, it probably is going to include some Aida. Now, something to stitch. You could find a pattern that you really love and are excited to stitch up, maybe as part of a kit or just as a downloadable PDF that you can print out or use on your phone. Or maybe you're the artistic type and you want to jump into designing something of your own straight away. Honestly, either way is fine. Cross-stitch patterns are basically just pixel art, with each stitch represented by a square on the chart. And they'll tell you what colour to use where, most often by recommending specific DMC colours. If you're designing something yourself though, just pick colours you like and experiment. I mean, what have you really got to lose? Okay, so that's the absolute basic stuff that you can't stitch without. And I suppose you could gnaw through your floss, but it's probably best to add a pair of scissors to that list too, so essentials, check. You could stitch happily for a long time without spending a single penny more. But let's get a bit more advanced. One of the first other things beginners tend to make the leap to is a hoop or another type of frame. Basically, this is an accessory that holds your fabric tight and flat, making it in many ways easier to stitch on. But don't misunderstand me, holding the fabric in your hand is a totally viable way to stitch, and it even allows for some techniques that you just can't do in a hoop. It's genuinely just personal preference. Many kits actually come with a hoop included. Usually it's going to be a relatively cheap plastic one like this one here, which is genuinely from my first ever kit. But you can also get wooden ones, which do tend to be a little more grippy than plastic and tend to hold the fabric a bit tighter. You can get decorative hoops for actually finishing and hanging your pieces in. It's a whole universe of hoops. The main thing you need to know to pick one though is what size you'll need. This one is a 6-inch hoop, which means the inner part that actually holds the fabric is 6 inches in diameter. This wooden one is 8 inches, and you can get all kinds of other sizes, both smaller and larger than these. If you're choosing a hoop to stitch in, I would advise avoiding the really big ones, because they're just kind of awkward to hold in one hand. But obviously if you're choosing a hoop to actually display a finished piece in, you need to make sure it's large enough for the piece to fit in, plus a little bit of space around the edge. stitch. Another popular type of frame is a Q-snap, which serves a similar purpose to a hoop but just does it in a different way. I personally love Q-snaps, and I have a whole video dedicated to every question and worry I could possibly think of surrounding them. So if you are interested in these, check that one out. Getting more advanced, you can get much larger and more complex frames that stand on the floor or a table or over your lap. This is not something you need about buying early, it's more a case of you'll know when you need one of these. And we've talked about hoops and snap frames, but scroll frames are very popular among people working on really big projects because they handle the excess fabric really well. So, frames. Worth investing in? Hoops are super cheap, and it's always worth trying one because if you do prefer it to stitching in hand, it'll probably change your life. Q-snaps are a little more expensive, and there's no guarantee you would like working with them, so it's probably worth holding off on that if money is a bit tight. If you try a decent wooden hoop and it's still not holding the fabric quite as tightly as you would like, then it's maybe time to give Q-snaps a look. All those fancier frames though, those can absolutely wait. One problem common with beginners, which is not immediately apparent but can cause trouble down the line, is that when you're handling a piece that you're working on so much, it can transfer quite a lot of dirt and oils from your hands into the fabric. This is probably going to be unnoticeable at first, but I'll put up some footage of my first ever project, and I'm not sure how well that's going to show on camera, but in real life, the oils have yellowed over time and become visible on the fabric. It's pretty gross. This happened because I was stitching in hand with no protection, and also I didn't know you were supposed to wash it at the end because I was brand new. So, how to avoid this? I mentioned washing the finished piece, which is definitely worth learning how to do, but also another good tip is to just prevent touching the fabric with your bare hands by using something like a grime guard. These are very simple washable covers for your hoop or your frame, and they just stop your sticky little fingers getting all over everything. They're cheap enough to pick up, or if you have access to a sewing machine, I have a tutorial on making your own here, which I am happy to say a few people have followed and had great success with. Before I started using those, I added pieces of felt to my Q-snap like so, and that also really helped to avoid excessive touching. Is something like this absolutely essential? No. You can probably get away with just washing things at the end, or in some cases, especially if you keep your hands very clean, not doing anything special at all. But if you're working on a longer or more meaningful project, or especially if it's going to be a gift, you absolutely want to avoid this kind of yellowing if you can. So I would say a grime guard is definitely an accessory worth looking into. Okay, now I promised you more detail on embroidery floss. As I said, DMC is by far the most popular brand, and it is a great place to start because A, most patterns are going to give their recommended colours in DMC shades. B, it's just good quality thread. C, their colours are consistent. You can buy huge grab bags of off-brand floss from places like Amazon, but unfortunately they come with a few problems. First of all, they'll often claim that they match the DMC colour shades, but as you can see, this is sometimes not true at all. That might not matter for your project, but if you're doing something that calls for a smooth gradient or otherwise just relies on a very specific shade, using the off-brand floss can make things look a little bit weird. This stuff does, in my experience, tend to tangle a lot more easily, and it's just generally a bit more fluffy than the DMC branded. And I've not tested this next thing myself, so genuinely apologies if this turns out to just be fear-mongering. But I have heard some horrendous anecdotes about the colours in off-brand floss bleeding, especially when you wash a finished piece. I don't know about you, but if I finish a months-long project, wash it, and it ends up with a big expanding red splotch in the middle of it, I am going to be absolutely gutted. All that said though, the off-brand stuff is so much cheaper, so I completely understand that that's sometimes all you can justify spending. I'm certainly not going to begrudge anybody using it, and also it could actually be a really good shout as a beginner to build a quick collection before you're really sure you're going to stick with the craft. On the other end of the spectrum, there are, of course, fancy flosses. This is everything from classic colourworks and threadworks to small batch hand-dyed skeins in Etsy shops. I know a lot of stitchers who absolutely love their fancy flosses and the slightly more elevated effects that you can get with them, but they are by no means necessary for a satisfying stitching career, and you should feel free to completely ignore them until the day that your curiosity outweighs your frugalness. As for the more speciality threads from DMC, your variegateds, your metallics, there's really not much point buying these until you need them for a specific project. Stick with the plain colours that 99.9% of the world's cross-stitch patterns were designed for, and you can't really go far wrong. Project bags are, at their most basic, just a way to keep everything you need for a given project together and organised. And I'm just going to say up front, yes, it is absolutely worth investing in project bags, especially if you're the type to end up with multiple works in progress. But you'll be unsurprised to hear that you really don't need the fancy ones. You're just keeping all your floss, fabric, etc. together in one place. So for that purpose, you could use a sturdy Ziploc bag. You could use a random tote bag you already have lying around the house. I bought a multi-pack of these random plastic zip pouches from Amazon years ago, and they have been absolutely brilliant. All you generally want is to be able to see what's in there without having to open every project bag you own and check inside. So yeah, something like this, absolutely spot on. Invest in some of these. Naturally though, if you are the sort of person who likes things to be pretty and coordinated and just generally enjoys the finer things in life, you could pick up a more specially designed project bag, like these handmade examples from Etsy, or this branded one I got from Caterpillar Cross Stitch a while ago. As you can see, it does have visibility into the contents on this side, but it's also made of a very sturdy canvas material that I was able to just literally throw in a suitcase and not worry at all about it getting crumpled. It also has a handy separate pocket on the front, so everything isn't just jumbled in one place. Great to have these fancier ones, but not necessary. And honestly, given the amount of floss tubers that I've seen using these exact bags, I'm going to say that's probably quite a popular sentiment. Needle minders are an oddly specific tool that you'll probably start coming across pretty early in your cross-stitch journey. These are decorative magnetic accessories that attach to your fabric and mind your needle for you so it doesn't get lost. Highly collectible, some people love to match the needle minder to the project they're stitching on, and it's just a nice pretty thing to have, you know? There are of course alternatives. You could use something like a pin cushion, or if you happen to be using these magnetic cable ties, which we will talk a little bit about later, they can serve double duty as needle minders too. Alternatively, just stick the needle through a couple of stitches and spend no money on anything whatsoever. So are needle minders worth it? Honestly, I would actually say yes, very much so, but that's kind of a personal thing. See, I'm terrible for losing needles. Give me half the chance and I will absolutely stick it somewhere it's not supposed to be and then forget where that place is. Being able to just basically drop what I'm doing and know that that needle is being kept safe is a game changer for someone like me. Now, you might find a pin cushion or something genuinely works better for you, in which case there's not really any point getting on the needle minder craze. But if you do want to give it a try, you can find some really cheap ones online, or to be honest, you could just stick a magnet to the back of a button or something else that you already own and sorted. Floss storage. Now, this is a big topic, so I'm just going to try and keep this section as brief as possible. You can store your floss in multiple ways, for example wound on bobbins and stored in a box, hung on floss drops and used as a sort of decorative display, maybe stuffed into baggies and kept filed away in a ring binder, and on and on. But of course for every method there are the cheap ways and there are the expensive ways. I started off, as many people do, with bobbins. So I picked up a pack of, I think it was about 200 flimsy plastic bobbins for like £2, and then this box that I got to store them in, I think cost me about £5. It took me hours and hours to wind everything onto bobbins and add labels with which colour was which. It was kind of a nightmare, but it did look beautiful once it was done. At the other extreme, you could get something like these pip and chip bobbins, which are made from thick, solid acrylic. They have the colours printed directly onto them, and they're even sized to fit in the gorgeous but very extravagant DMC branded wooden storage cabinet. Nowadays, I use floss drops, which I literally made myself at home out of plain white cardboard because that's what I had handy. There's a whole video on this if you are also feeling very cheap. Or again, if you want something more durable, less time intensive to set up, and of course much more expensive, Pip and Chip have you covered there too. Of course I'm just using Pip and Chip products as an example here. There are all kinds of other options along a wide spectrum of expense. And we've not even mentioned all of the other storage systems that people use. Honestly, that could be a whole video topic in itself. So how do you know what's worth investing in? Well, what I would say here is that every stitcher does seem to eventually settle on a storage method that works best for them. But you don't know what that storage method is going to be unless you try stuff. And of course, there's no point jumping straight in with the expensive supplies when you are not 100% sure that this is going to be the method for you. Imagine if I had bought that DMC cabinet back when I thought bobbins were the way to go. Oof. As a cross-stitcher, you are a crafty person, and I believe in your ability to mock these systems up and test them for cheap. You can worry about all of those fancy upgrades as and when they become necessary. Okay. Lights and magnifiers. I'm putting these together because they are obviously both potential solutions to the same problem, which is eye strain. The better the lighting, the more clearly you can see what you're doing. And a magnifier is going to mean you don't need to focus quite as hard on each individual stitch. There are so many options, from just putting an extra lamp in your room, to a head torch, to these snazzy deals that sit around your neck. Clip-on magnifiers that you can add to your stitching frame, or full-on steampunk mad scientist vibes. If you're working on dark fabrics, some stitchers absolutely swear by getting a light box to shine a light through from the back of the work and make those holes really easy to find. Personally, I've not had much experience adding either of these to my stitching routine, so I'm going to ask anybody watching this who has to please share your recommendations down in the comments. I really appreciate you helping other stitchers out. Thank you. Broadly speaking though, are these worth investing in? Well, your eyesight is pretty important, so I'm just gonna say yes, absolutely, as soon as you know that this is the craft for you and that your setup is less than ideal. Maybe you're like me and all you're gonna have to do is slightly adjust the position of one lamp. But on the other hand, maybe you have poor eyesight, or you're working in a badly lit room or with tiny stitches. And if that's the case, honestly, I think it's better safe than sorry with something as important as your eyesight. In fact, you know what? I'm just gonna take my own advice. I'm gonna order something magnifying as soon as I'm finished recording this video. Now, okay, I want to add thread conditioner to this list because it has come up so many times in the comments on previous videos. I know the people out there love their thread conditioner. But confession time, I have still not actually invested in any myself. Sorry. Basically, you run your floss through a thing of thread conditioner and it makes it glide through the fabric more easily and tangle apparently a lot less. It claims to reduce strain on your hands and wrists as well as wear and tear on the fabric, and it sounds great, it really does. But whether it actually is worth it, unfortunately, I don't know. Opinions on this stuff and also judgment of my terrible priorities, very welcome down in the comments. Now, for this last section, I'm just going to quickly mention a few miscellaneous tools, because as we've seen, what's actually essential kind of depends on your personal needs and also what kind of project you're working on. So for example, if you struggle to thread your needle, then you might want to invest in a needle threader, but if you don't have that struggle, then it's kind of a pointless purchase. If you find yourself pulling out stitches frequently and getting into knots while doing so, you could look into a seam ripper. Just be really careful that you are ripping stitches and not the fabric. It's a tough lesson to learn. Maybe despite your best efforts and a lot of practice, your stitches just aren't looking as neat as you would like them to. Check out a laying tool to help them lie flatter. Or maybe the issue is just that they're too loose, in which case, snag nab it. One thing I mentioned earlier in passing was a set of magnetic cable ties. I use these along with my Q-snap to hold excess fabric in place, but they also double up as handy needle minders. Two birds with one very cheap stone? That's my kinda style. We talked a little bit about floss storage methods, and depending which one you end up going with, a thread keeper might be a handy investment. Basically, you just transfer the floss that you're going to need for a given project onto your thread keeper and shove that in your project bag. Job done. Because I've gone with floss drops, I can just throw all of the colours I need for my project onto a metal ring. As you can see, it just depends on your personal setup. If you're extra frugal and you like to get every millimetre possible out of each strand of floss, maybe check out a tail tucker to deal with those annoying small tails that get left behind. If you want to start adding beads to your project, you'll need a beading needle. If you have dreams of becoming the next big floss tuber, maybe you'll end up using a floss board to hold up whatever floss you're talking about to your millions of loyal YouTube viewers. And etc, etc, etc. I'm sure there are plenty of things that I've just completely forgotten to mention in this video, and probably quite a lot of things that I've never even heard of myself. Because cross-stitch is like most other things. You can start off really simply, but as you get into it, it's kind of a rabbit hole. Still, hopefully this video has helped give you an idea of where it's worth following said rabbit hole, versus where you might want to just resist temptation, at least for a little while. If there's anything you think I glossed over too quickly, or maybe there's something from that miscellaneous section that you'd like to hear more about, please let me know and I'll see what I can do. Thank you, as always, to all of my enablers over on Ko-fi, but especially to the Stitch Squad. Stitching Liz, Marianne Johnson, Sunny, Laura Salletz, Candy Riley Pedinger, and Rosalie. I look forward to hearing all of your opinions on this down in the comments. Did I miss something that is essential to invest in early on? Do you find that treating yourself to all of the fancy things actually improves your hobby? Inquiring minds want to know. I'll be back soon with some more crafty nonsense, so in the meantime, have a brilliant rest of your day and keep making cool stuff.